short as well.
Shall I read all of it?
Thank you for being here, everyone. This is the first of our Grand Challenge sessions titled Precarious Citizenship, the Use and Misuse of Deprivation of Nationality. We like to begin all of our Grand Challenges by remembering the many millions of people that we have gathered here on behalf of. Several of those who are not permitted to travel to be here with us. So may I please ask you to set aside your phones and connect your hearts and minds with not just the complex issues of statelessness, but the people of statelessness. We read you the words of Hannah Arendt. We wanted to rebuild our lives. That was all. In order to rebuild one's life, one has to be strong and an optimist, so we are very optimistic. Our optimism, indeed, is admirable, even if we say so ourselves. The story of our struggle has finally become known. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. How often have we been told that nobody likes to listen to that? Apparently, nobody wants to know that contemporary history has created a new kind of human beings, the kind that are put in concentration camps by their foes and in internment camps by their friends. Even among ourselves, we don't speak about this past. Instead, we have found our own way of mastering an uncertain future. Since everybody has plans and wishes and hopes, so do we. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisling, for focusing our minds. A very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Christoph Paulussen, and I'm with the IOHR Institute and the International Center for Counterterrorism, both located here in The Hague. And I'm honored to moderate the very first Grand Challenges session of the World Conference on Statelessness. And we have a truly stellar panel for you with excellent speakers who will focus on the topic precarious citizenship, the use and misuse of deprivation of nationality. Now, from our research, we have seen that there's an upward trend in the use of nationality deprivation as an administrative measure in response to perpetrated threats to national security or terrorism. At the same time, little consideration is given to its legitimacy or effectiveness. And this panel looks at the phenomenon of deprivation of nationality as a national security and counterterrorism measure through a combination of personal stories, legal analysis, and historical insights. And as you may have noticed, there are fewer people on stage that are actually mentioned in the program, and that's because Jim Goldson, Executive Director from Open Society Justice Initiative, has informed us that he's unfortunately ill and cannot attend. But he apologizes and he stresses that this topic is very close to Open Society's heart, a statement which I fully support, having worked with Jim and his team, in particular Laura Bingham, for a few years now. However, to make up for this lacuna, we have an additional speaker that is not mentioned in the program, and I will come back to this later. Also, we would like to encourage you, the conference participants, to use social media to raise the profile of the conference and the issues addressed, so please feel free to use the conference hashtags and the Twitter handles of the organizers. Now, with these words in mind, let's turn to our speakers, who have, by the way, very, very long and impressive CV, so my apologies in advance for only picking out a few main things here. So our first speaker is Jawad Fairoz. He's chairman of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, which is an NGO created following the crackdown in Bahrain in 2011 and focusing on human rights and democracy issues and seeking reprieve for human rights victims. And from 2006 to 2011, Jawad was a Bahraini member of parliament, and during his time as an MP, he was chairman of Public Utilities and Environmental Committee. And he currently lives in exile in London since November 2012. And he was one of the first batch of Bahrainis forcibly stripped of Bahraini nationality. And I think more than anyone else, he's really in a position to talk about the impact that deprivation of nationality can have on the lives of individuals. So Jawad, thank you so much for being with us. And you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm happy to be with you today, and I want to thank ISI for arranging this important conference and the rest of the NGOs and networks that we are working on these subjects, and I hope that all together we can achieve something. I can see a bright light at the end of this dark channel, so please keep going. Because I have very, very short limited time, 7 minutes to 8 minutes, so I prefer to make it a short slides, linked to 1 or 2 YouTube to utilize my most points. I'll come back to this photo later on. You click on the video. Is it? Should be PowerPoint linked to. I can see it there, but not on the screen. No. Okay, I come back to it. No, not playing. No. Yes. Yeah. In Bahrain, I was inactive, being MP, in the same time being part of one of the largest political parties, which was Al-Wafaq. But definitely, I used to leave the weekend for my family. I used to not answer any calls and try to be too close to my family to give them enough time during the weekend. They fabricated many different charges that I was trying to topple the government. I was engaged with the foreign countries, and I am traitor. In the same time, other minor charges related to the leading illegal demonstrations without permissions and fabricating news and stories about Bahrain and damaging reputation of the government and so on. And I've been detained and remain under custody for 3 months and 7 days, and I've been transferred to 4 different prisons and different type of the tortures I've been facing. At the end, I'm human. I'm away from my country, I'm away from my neighborhood, I'm away from my larger family, and I'm away from my community. And this is really make me homesick so many. Thank you very much. And can we go back to the original, please, slides? Sorry for this disturbance. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Is it working? Yes, so I don't want to go through too much time on what is the statelessness, and everyone, I think you're aware about the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have how do people become stateless? There are now many ways that it is not just that because you are not belonging to that country. Discrimination, nationality, as we heard from our speakers from last sessions, and we have emergence of new states and change in borders. You can see so many countries examples. We have loss of declaration of nationality, which is my case, and now it's being used as a political tool in so many countries, part of it the Gulf states. I can mention here Bahrain, I can mention UAE, Qatar, and some other countries in that region. Now, the consequences of statelessness, we have here a list of the consequences, and I am focusing on a few of them. Now, citizenship revocation in Bahrain, as nationality, how been specified in the constitution, theoretically it is fine. No one should be without nationality, but in reality it's totally different than that one. The government, what they done, they want to legitimize this action. They made amendment to two main laws. One law is related to the citizenship law or nationality law, where they mention here that the full power is being given to Minister of Interior. Suppose you are away from the country for more than 5 years and they are suspicious about your loyalty to the ruling family, then definitely they have right to revoke your nationality, as simple as that. And there are so many other cases in this regard. And they made amendment, what they call it, the anti-terrorism law. Imagine that someone is being charged of bearing a tire in the street for opposition to the government, then they will think that this is a terrorist act, then he will be charged for so many years in sentence in the jail, and part of it, his nationality will be revoked. We came to some statistics. They started with us in 2012 with 31 citizens. They revoked their nationality just by a governmental order. It was just a statement by the Minister of Interior. Coincidentally, I was here in UK coming for short vacation, where I received a call from my wife telling me that through the media, through the official TV, Bahraini TV, they announced the revoking nationality of 31 citizens, and my name was there. Without any prior notification, it was not through the court, and yet I don't know what is the reason. So that's as simple as that, that they think that they have the right, either the king or the government, to revoke the nationality of anyone without to be questioned and without giving any proof of evidence of that. For example, in my case, I never had any other nationality, yet I don't have any other nationality, and being elected member for 10 years, 4 years I was elected councillor, for more than 5 to 6 years I was twice for 2 terms I was elected MP, and as simple as that, someone elected by the people will be revoke his nationality by someone who's not elected. Bahraini government is not elected at all. So statistic-wise, 2012, 31 with us. Then they continue in this process, 2014, 21. And then 2008, 2015, they increased to 2008. Then 2016, 90. 2017, 156. 2018, 298. 2019, until before that date, which is in green one, it was 181. But due to your efforts and to the international pressures, and then the government or the king, he a little bit drew back, and he retained the nationality of 551. So he retained the 551. But even that one, I think it is not right decision. Why? Because some legislations to be amended, not just a decision by one person. He decided to revoke, and he will decide to reinstate nationality, which is, I think that should be part of certain legislation that never ever revoking nationality to be considered part of any targeting as a political tools, never ever should be part of any penal code. So now total we have 434, more or less in this number. Even the High Commissioner in day before yesterday in Human Rights Council, in her speech, she mentioned Bahrain, and she mentioned how concerned they are about this continuation. We have the effects of the nationality revocation decision. We have now, you can see here, depression of the newborn child nationality. Anyone without nationality now in Bahrain, his newborn baby will not have any nationality. Then we have the bearing of the rights to work, especially in government positions. Even if you have any position in the government or even private sectors, you will be sacked from your job. Bearing of the use of many services available to them. Let us say that any healthcare, housing services, education, all this will be barred. Depression of pension. I had a pension, now I don't have that one, and they stopped my pension through all the time. Even the bank account, you cannot have your bank account, it will be closed. Even if you have a private property, you cannot deal with it, which is in my case the same. The banning of travel outside. If you are in Bahrain, that's it, and you will have two choices. Either by yourself to decide to leave the country, or you will be in detention center for some time, because they think that you are illegally staying. And if you can find someone to, let us say, sponsor you, then maybe you can stay in the country. But sponsoring is not that much easy because you don't have any IDs or any official documentations. Keeping on the collision damage of the citizenship, here you have all these ones which is listed down. I have here so many cases that in Bahrain happened, but due to the technology, I don't want to go through it. We have so many people that they've been away. Today, they are up to the country. Next time, they told them your nationality has been revoked without any reasons, without any justifications, just because due to some political reasons, and that this was the case. 10 actions to be taken by UN. You have it in front of you. I already listed the most important one. Part of it, I think, time counts now. There should be a special rapporteur and a UN mechanism that they can deal with this case. It is not enough that the special rapporteur of the minority, he can take the complaints. We have to get a special rapporteur that we can have one particular one that he can follow up the case. Preventing statelessness in cases of state cessation, and the rest of the list. We have grant protection status to stateless migrants and facilities there. Get it. We designed a website called Ana Bahraini, I am Bahraini, that we have all the data, videos, records, reports, statistics. You can find it here, that whenever we've been contacted by the media or research center and so on, we refer them to this website that we can have everything in one location, like bank of data. Back to this chair. I've been to the garden, and I think all of you can see such chair. The beautiful about it, some people used to frequently visit the garden, and when they pass away, their loved one, they mention his name on the chair to remember him. See, if you're born in a country and you serve the country and you've been part of it, and by sudden your name will be deleted from that country, it is really heartbreaking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jawad. Well, not only for explaining, of course, the Bahraini context, but especially for sharing your personal story. I think immediately showing that what we are talking about and how severe the consequences can be of deprivation of nationality. Now, our second speaker is Matthew Gibney. He's professor of politics and forced migration at the University of Oxford. He specializes in the political and ethical issues raised by refugees, citizenship, and migration control. And born in Melbourne, Australia, he was educated at Monash University and as a Commonwealth Scholar at King's College at the University of Cambridge. He has published widely on asylum, deportation, citizenship, globalization, and statelessness. And so we're very happy to have with us such an outstanding academic. And Matthew, maybe it would be possible for you to place, let's say, recent moves in denationalization in a more historical and contemporary perspective and its wider implications. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Is it on?
You can use this one.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for having me here today. This is really a kind of marvelous event, which I've never been to before, and I'm really, really proud to be able to talk to you here. Over the last 2 decades, what we've seen across Western countries is quite a remarkable turn to denationalisation, which is, of course, the involuntary removal of citizenship. And the main driving force behind this turn is pretty clear. It's a response largely to Islamist terrorism in the form largely of Al-Qaeda and now ISIS. Yet I think what's much less clear is the significance of this turn towards denationalisation. After all, in most countries, the power to strip citizenship, where it exists, despite its rather noisy reappearance in the public realm, is still used quite sparingly. Its various legal incarnations have been hedged in by norms against statelessness. And in some countries, the attempt to legislate new powers have been met with formidable political resistance. If the current denationalisation turn is widespread, then its practical manifestations, one could argue, are often rather shallow. And in this view, denationalisation is a showy but rather insignificant new phenomenon. Well, in my view, this is a very optimistic take on the current state of affairs. And it's this view, what I would call the benign view, that I hope to go some way to dismantling in the few minutes that I have available to me here. My main weapon to do so is to draw upon the experience of the UK, certainly the most radical recent exponent of denationalisation power among liberal democracies, certainly not next to Bahrain. Now, I've studied denationalisation in the UK for about 10 years now, and I've been constantly surprised, even shocked, by the changing use of this power over time. Let's look then at how the UK challenges 4 observations that I think are central to this benign view. The first concerns the issue of numbers. It might be said that when it all comes down to it, despite all the hoo-ha, the denationalisation turn is mostly a kind of theatrical or gesture politics that involves politicians talking loudly but carrying a rather small stick. Across most states, the number of terrorists actually stripped of citizenship under denationalisation laws over the last decade has been rather small. The same was true in the UK historically as well. Despite revocation of citizenship being possible on a wide range of grounds, only 12 people lost their citizenship between 1950 and 2002. And this tradition of broad powers but low use continued into the 2000s. In the 5 years following the 2005 London terrorist attacks, which saw the standard required for citizenship stripping greatly eased, only around 6 people lost their citizenship. Yet we need to look here at what happened when the Conservatives came to control the Home Office in 2010. Then denationalisation shot up. In 2017, the last year for which we have figures, the number of deprivations was a whopping 104 people. That's more than any other single year in UK history, reaching back to the origins of the power just after World War I, at the end of World War I. Moreover, this large increase was not undertaken with fanfare. It was quietly done behind the scenes and largely left unpublicised by the government. Whatever else it is, UK denationalisation power is no longer simply a gesture. It's a practical and regularly employed state tool. Now, another reason for thinking that denationalisation will be limited in liberal states is that it's hemmed in on laws relating to statelessness. Indeed, it's a remarkable feature of the current denationalisation turn that new laws are targeted generally at dual nationals. The UK has a long tradition as a supporter of laws protecting individuals against statelessness. In the 1960s, following its signing of the Statelessness Convention, Britain amended its laws, making it more difficult to deprive nationals of citizenship if statelessness would ensue. Legislation in the 2000s was also carefully crafted to ensure the power was used only against dual nationals. Once again, however, changes in the last few years upset this more progressive trajectory. In 2014, the Conservative government presented a bill to Parliament enabling it to strip naturalised citizens of their citizenship even if it made them stateless. It was able to do this in part because the UK is not a signatory to the UN Convention on Nationality. Now, despite some parliamentary hostility to this new legislation, new powers did emerge, enabling naturalised citizens to lose citizenship if the Home Secretary believed that they could access, even while they do not possess, a second citizenship. Deprivation laws in the UK now mean that making people stateless is acceptable, albeit that it's supposed to be temporary. Now, it's also important to note that the Australian government now seems to be preparing legislation that is set to follow the UK's lead in this regard. A third reason why some see the denationalisation turn as rather benign is the success of some countries in pushing back against denationalisation pressures. The Trudeau government in Canada famously repealed the Harper government's legislation expanding powers of citizenship stripping upon coming to office. Francois Hollande's measures to make all French dual nationals, including the native-born, subject to revocation powers, failed to win support of both houses of the French Parliament. But despite these moments of resistance, denationalisation has made inroads in many places. In the UK, each of the 3 times denationalisation powers have been broadened since 2002, the changes have emerged as relatively uncontroversial and certainly is not a site of major political conflict. The closest thing to a national controversy regarding the power emerged earlier this year in the case of Shamima Begum, the jihadi bride stripped of her citizenship by the current Home Secretary. Yet what made her case controversial was that she was young, a mother, and had pretty clearly been groomed in the UK before leaving the country. The power itself was questioned by virtually no one, just its applicability on this particular case. Now, a final reason for accepting the benign view is that the power is confined to a small and exceptional group whose hostility to the state is obvious. Terrorists and terrorist supporters. Denationalisation, the argument goes, is firmly connecting to protecting state and society from the gravest of grave threats. Of course, denationalisation power in many countries, including the UK, has historically been used for a range of other crimes as well. But that is the past. Well, no, it's not. In 2015, in July, the Home Secretary of the UK announced her intention to revoke the citizenship of 4 men involved in what was called the Rochdale sex ring, for which they had each been sentenced to jail. These men certainly had committed appalling crimes. They had raped and exploited young women on a regular and organised basis between 2008 and 2010. But the dual nationality of some of these offenders, these Asian offenders, enabled the British state, in addition to jailing them, to strip them of their citizenship with the intention of sending them back to Pakistan. It is clear then that the British government is now beginning to expand the reach of citizenship stripping to serious domestic crimes. Now, what does all this amount to? Is the UK the harbinger of the future of denationalisation across the West, or perhaps just an outlier, some exceptional case? To be honest, I'm not completely sure of the answer to this. But Britain's transformation from a country that was a reluctant and exceptional user of this power to its current state of affairs is truly remarkable. The change in many respects is attributable to the emergence of a Conservative government desirous of strict measures across the board in terms of immigration and citizenship. And in continental Europe, not least in this country, where populist forces are on the rise, a similar expansion of denationalisation is surely not impossible. Now, the current denationalisation turn pretty much started in Britain in the early 2000s and spread from there. I think we have to hope, and I think we have to struggle against the fact that its radical new manifestations in Britain are less easily exported. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew, for that. I think you've clearly shown the danger in current attempts across Europe and beyond to revive this symbolic but also still and more often used and expanding power. So we now turn to yet another excellent scholar, Audrey Macklin. She's a full professor since 2009 at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. And she holds law degrees from Yale and Toronto and a Bachelor of Science degree from Alberta. And her teaching areas include criminal law, administrative law, and immigration and refugee law. And her research and writing interests include transnational migration, citizenship, forced migration, feminism and cultural analysis, and human rights. And perhaps, Audrey, you could zoom in further on the distinction that was already made by Matthew between dual and mono citizens in the context of deprivation of nationality, possibly taking into account your own Canadian context. If the technology does not abandon us.
It's okay. I can speak without the slide. Thanks. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. This morning, Laura challenged us to think about what practices we thought would have been banished by now. Well, I'd put banishment among one of those, and that's what we're talking about here. We already heard about Shamima Begum. I'm going to speak a little bit about another UK citizen who's facing potential deprivation of citizenship. His name is Jack Letts, and he's the photo on the left. And I'm going to use his case and reference it back to Shamima Begum's case to actually consider the state perspective on citizenship deprivation. Now that seems odd. We all know what the alleged state interest is in taking away people's citizenship. It is useful as a means of disposing of certain problems of bad citizens and thereby improving the security of the state. But I want to raise that up one level and just think about not the individual state's interests, but what is in the interest of the state system as a whole with respect to citizenship deprivation. And I'm going to use two ideas that float around as a way of considering this. And one, you hear a lot about citizenship, and it comes out of the mouths of politicians of all stripes, of all countries. Citizenship is a privilege, it's not a right. And therefore, as a privilege, if you misbehave, we can revoke that privilege. Another idea that is commonplace in the international system is if there is a rule or a law that is a good idea for one state, it ought to be a good idea, good rule, good law for other states. Not to go all Kantian on you, but this idea that there is a kind of principle that if there is an idea or a norm that holds true for one, it should hold true for others. I want to hold that idea as well. So let me just start with this guy on the left, Jack Letts. Born in the United Kingdom to a UK mother and a Canadian citizen father. You know about Shamima Begum? Born in the UK to parents who are Bangladeshi. Both of them made their way to Syria and areas around Syria where they're both now being detained and on the allegation that they were members, fighters for ISIS. Jack Letts' citizenship has not been stripped by the UK, at least not yet. And it's interesting and important here to note that for a change, the other state of citizenship is another wealthy Western country, namely Canada. And I think it's useful for our purposes because states who think about adopting rules of citizenship deprivation, at least in the global north, always imagine themselves to be on one side of this equation. That is, they imagine themselves to be, if you will, the disposing state. They don't actually imagine themselves to be the state of disposal. But here, Canada would now find itself on that side. Now, think about this through the lens of privilege and right. So, the UK says it can revoke Jack Letz's citizenship if it chooses to do so, because citizenship is a privilege, not a right, and he has behaved badly. Well, now, that idea that citizenship is a privilege for the UK can only work if, for Canada, citizenship is Jack Letz's right. That Canada cannot resist or deny to Jack Letz, no matter how badly he's behaved. So now you have this idea that citizenship is a privilege for the state that revokes it, but citizenship must be a right of the citizen for the other state of nationality. How can a system withstand that kind of incoherence? How can citizenship be a privilege that the UK can take away, but a right that Canada has a duty to recognize? Now, the UK has not, in fact, revoked Letz's citizenship, and maybe it won't do it. And if it doesn't do it, my guess, for what it's worth, is that there is indeed privilege involved here. Canada's not Bangladesh. Jack Letz is the white son of white secular Christians. Canada's not a weak country. And if the UK threatens or proceeds with revocation, Canada's going to be very unhappy. Canada will say something along the lines of, Jack Letz may be a citizen of Canada by virtue of jus sanguinis, birth to a Canadian citizen father, but he does not belong more to Canada than to the UK, the country where he grew up and spent almost his entire life. And indeed, if Jack Letz is some kind of security threat to the UK, the very things that make him a security threat to the UK make him no less or different a threat to Canada. And indeed, that is the case, more generally. Whatever the basis is for calling somebody a security threat in a climate where terrorism is understood as a problem of global proportions that affects all states, then it cannot be the case that the citizen that is being denationalized only represents a threat to that state and that state only. When we are outside the world of state versus state conflict, that kind of logic no longer operates. So, interestingly here, I think, if you can imagine Canada saying, Jack Letz doesn't belong to Canada more than he belongs to the UK, and so there's something inequitable about depriving him of UK citizenship in order to, as it were, impose him solely on Canada, then what you're seeing here is an idea that is, if not suppressed, then not always visible in the statist approach to citizenship. In international law, traditionally, citizenship is something rather fungible, right? One citizenship is as good as the next. If you revoke citizenship, the point is to not make somebody stateless. As long as they have one citizenship, doesn't matter what that citizenship is, they're not stateless, and we don't really care what that citizenship is. That would be the international statist view. From the human perspective, of course, it matters dramatically and radically. Your connection to one state is not fungible, it's not replaceable, it isn't the same as a connection to another state. But here, if you start to position the UK against Canada, you can imagine Canada also taking the view that citizenship isn't fungible. It's not the same to say that one is a Canadian citizen as it is to a UK citizen when you take into account the kinds of connections. Interestingly, that doesn't seem to be operating with respect to the UK and Bangladesh. Is that because Bangladesh is a weak country? Is it because no matter what Shamima Begum's citizenship in the UK is, and no matter what her actual connections are, from the UK perspective, she never fully belonged to the UK in the same way that Jack Letz belonged to the UK? And if so, then the measure of her belonging to Bangladesh looks different than Jack Letz's belonging to Canada by comparison. So the point I'm really trying to make here is something like this. I don't buy the idea that citizenship is a privilege and not a right, but there is no doubt that some citizens are more privileged than others, and some citizenships are more privileged than others. Last point I want to raise with you goes on with this to the idea that, well, if citizenship revocation is such a great idea, why don't we all do it? Why don't all states do it as a sensible response to the threat posed by dual nationals who are a security threat? So Canada, again, is a good laboratory for that question, because between the years 2014 and 2017, as Matthew pointed out, we had a law that permitted the revocation of citizenship for persons in a situation similar to Jack Lett's. So let's imagine for a moment that we're in that world where Canada still has a law that permits revocation of citizenship for lack of a better term, bad behavior by a citizen. Okay, so now what kind of situation are we in? Jack Lett's is in Syria. The UK doesn't want him. It has a law that would permit it to revoke his citizenship, but Canada doesn't want him either. And it also has a law that would permit it to revoke his citizenship. So what do you get? A race between Canada and the UK to see who can revoke his citizenship faster. And to the loser goes the citizen. Is this a policy that makes sense as a global practice directed at making the world more secure, at reducing the risk of terrorism and so on? To my mind, not so much. And so we have heard, and there's much to be said about the human rights violations involved in citizenship stripping, and I fully subscribe to those. But I wanted to raise for you here a slightly different lens through which to view this, which is it even in the interests of the state system to permit such practices to go on? And my answer to that is clearly no. And I will raise only one point for consideration, if I may, and then I will sit down, which is, to some extent, I think we should recognize that talking about citizenship revocation today is already speaking a little bit to the past, because states are now no longer, states are not only looking at citizenship revocation, and may even be looking less at citizenship revocation than to other less visible administrative techniques for controlling the mobility of citizens. And that in particular refers to passport revocation, passport cancellation, ways and mechanisms of preventing those who are abroad from returning to their country of nationality without actually stripping them of nationality. It is, in a sense, an analog to the idea of de facto statelessness. And so even as we are right now talking about citizenship deprivation and the harms and its wrongs, I think we should also have an eye to the next frontier, if you will, of that, which is the manipulation of the rights that attend to citizenship, namely the right to enter and remain in one's own country, and the ways in which states are now manipulating those in the service of what ultimately citizenship deprivation, I think, is about, which is an instrumental tactic for controlling the mobility of people on Earth. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Audrey. You basically explained about the race to the bottom. But I really indeed liked your distinction also between the disposing state and the state of disposal. And I think this is also really about taking responsibility of states that are in a global hyper-connected world and not to export your risk to other countries, really dumping your problem elsewhere. Now, our surprise of the panel, again, if technology doesn't abandon us, we have a video recording from New York featuring Edward Flynn, and he's a senior human rights officer with CTAD, that's the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, and he will highlight a few main challenges from the side of CTAD on this topic.
Greetings from New York, and thank you to Amal, Laura, and the Institute for inviting me to the conference. I'm sorry I can't be there. And my greetings also to Christoph Paulsen, my old friend, who I understand is moderating this session. It is only recently, I have to say, that the UN counterterrorism bodies have focused their attention on the issue of statelessness. And sadly, our raised awareness has come about for obvious and disturbing reasons. There's no doubt that in addressing the threat of terrorism, some member states are now turning to deprivation of nationality as a policy response, at least as a measure of last resort. The reasons for this seem to cover a significant range. Certainly, some governments see this as a rational and justified response to the actions of individuals who had acquired a second nationality in their country and then, in the view of those governments, had acted in a manner prejudicial to those states' national interest, or had even taken up arms against those states. In this sense, deprivation of nationality has been essentially a sanction, though in most cases, at least, it seems that states are more hesitant about revoking citizenship if statelessness might result. Another rationale used by states has certainly been the need to ensure the security of their populations. These states perceive a clear threat if persons who had left their territories to engage in terrorist activities overseas are then received back on their territories, possibly to live freely in their former communities. States do, after all, have a human rights obligation to safeguard the rights to life and to personal security. It is important also to remember that in states that strive to ensure compliance with the rule of law, it may be difficult to detain and prosecute certain individuals for terrorist acts allegedly committed overseas, since it is often difficult to secure the necessary evidence. Thus, states fear that their communities may be genuinely under threat from individuals who embrace terrorist ideologies and who live freely in their societies, and thus they consider deprivation of nationality as an option. These arguments are not irrational. At the same time, however, one could make the argument that in their impact, these approaches do comparatively little to enhance international peace and security. After all, if one state refuses to accept or facilitate the return of its former residents, including by revoking citizenship, then those people could present a threat to the territories where they currently find themselves. It would also make it more difficult to hold these individuals accountable for their alleged crimes by preventing national courts from asserting jurisdiction based on the nationality of the alleged perpetrator. Moreover, decisions to revoke citizenship from certain individuals are likely to have a severe impact not only on those persons, but on those close to them, most notably family members. And that could even serve as a factor in radicalization leading to future terrorist violence. The Security Council, in its Resolution 2396 of December 2017, called upon states to adopt prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration strategies to deal with foreign terrorist fighters, or FTFs, in accordance with international law. The Council recalled that states are obliged to ensure that persons who have been engaged in the commission of terrorist acts are brought to justice. It also highlighted the situation of family members associated with FTFs, notably women and children, and stressed that such persons may have served in different roles, possibly as perpetrators of terrorist acts, but also that they may have been victims. The Council concluded that the handling of cases of suspected FTFs and their family members should take full account both of states' human rights obligations as well as age and gender sensitivities. It seems the Council was urging states to take proactive action in this area. As you probably know, the Secretary General has now called upon the UN system to come together to better support states in addressing the challenge posed by FTFs, as well as their family members who may be trapped in conflict zones. He has stressed that, quote, all policies and actions that lead to statelessness must be avoided, close quote. In a policy document issued by his office in April 2019, it was stressed that member states have the primary responsibility for their own nationals. It was also stressed that safeguards and processes that protect people from becoming stateless must be in place. Colleagues and friends, there is no doubt that the challenges faced by the global community in countering terrorism are substantial. That is as true in the context of efforts to prevent statelessness as it is in other difficult areas. It is a positive step, I believe, that UN counterterrorism actors are now engaged on the question of how to ensure that counterterrorism policies and measures do not unavoidably lead to the result that more people become stateless. The Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee and our office, CTED, are raising this issue with states in our dialogue on the Security Council's counterterrorism resolutions. As you know, different states are grappling with this issue in different ways, and I cannot tell you today that the Counterterrorism Committee has adopted a clear and unequivocal position on this issue. But the Security Council has been clear that all counterterrorism measures must comply with states' obligations under international law. And that gives us the basis we need to continue to engage on this issue with member states. In doing so, we will definitely continue to work closely with the Institute and with all of you present at the conference. Many thanks and all the best from New York.
I think it was also very interesting to hear more, let's say, from the side of states and to hear about their justifications for resorting to this practice, but also that he again stressed the point that Audrey also mentioned, the fact that we're in this hyper-connected world and that we should actually not dodge our responsibilities. And also like that he stressed the word accountability. It's really in denial of justice if you deprive suspected terrorists of their nationality. And again, the focus on all counter-terrorism measures being in accordance with international law. Now, last but not least, the final speaker of our panel, Amal Shikera. He's a co-founder and co-director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, and he's leading the Institute's human rights engagement work. And he also plays an important part in the Institute's work on childhood statelessness, gender discrimination, and the Sustainable Development Agenda, and on the Institute's engagement with civil society and the arts. And he's particularly interested in the nexus between statelessness and discrimination and its implications on access to other rights. Well, Amal, you've been extremely busy organizing this conference, so congratulations again, and wonderful you have found the time to actually be part of this panel. Well, having heard all of this, what do you think are, let's say, the next steps in your view? What can be done about this practice?
Thank you so much, Christoph, for the introduction, and to all the panelists that preceded me, who have left me with very little more to say. I'm going to basically start my presentation by talking a little bit about what us at the Institute and some of our partners have been thinking about the issue and trying to do about the issue, and then reflect on what I believe are three crucial fault lines, which we should not disregard, and which I think we need to address head on. So in terms of the issue of citizenship stripping, it's one which us at the Institute have been deeply concerned with for a number of years. We share this concern with our partners, OSJI. Laura and Betsy of OSJI are here with us today. Jim, unfortunately, is ill, so he couldn't be here. We also consider Assay Institute one of our closest partners on this, and Ashurst, the law firm who've been providing us with a great deal of support. Our four organizations, 2 years ago now, we decided that we needed to take stock of what was happening and try and do something in response. We convened a small group of experts who pushed us to be more ambitious in our plans, which led us to do a detailed bit of research on the extent to which citizenship stripping powers are used around the world, and to also get a better handle of what the legal framework which is applicable. This research resulted in an expert meeting which we conducted yesterday, so the 25th of June 2018, and the outcome of that meeting was we were tasked with coming up with a set of principles on the deprivation of nationality as a national security and counterterrorism measure. We've since been working hard at this, and we are now currently working on a draft which has been reviewed by a number of experts, colleagues, including many of you in the room. And we are well on the way towards producing something which will be shared with you. All shall be revealed, I would say, watch this space for the next 12 months or so. But I mean, one of the main points, which I think also ties up to what Matt was saying, when we did this scoping of countries giving themselves the power to strip citizenship, was that yes, a growing number of countries are doing this, but still the majority of countries in the world do not. They think it's unthinkable, in fact. If we look at the great work that has been done by Catherine Harrington, a wonderful colleague, and the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, what they've done very effectively is point out how ludicrous it is that 25 countries in the world still deny women the equal right to pass citizenship onto their children. And I think we have a duty to simply point out in a similar way how ludicrous it is that a certain number of countries in the world think it's within their right to strip their citizens of their citizenship. It's the same issue, but coming at it from another end. The difference between the two issues is that with the gender discrimination issue, the trajectory is downward. We are seeing great progress. But as Matt pointed out, as all the other panelists have alluded to, with this issue, the trajectory is going the other way. So there's a real urgency for us to do more on this issue. And that takes me to my 3 reflections on the 3 fault lines that I think we owe it to ourselves and the global community to reflect on. And some of these have already been touched on in various guises by the other panelists. The first is this tension, or perceived tension, as I'd like to put it, between national sovereignty and human rights. Is it the right of the state to revoke nationality, or is it the right of the individual to retain nationality? As Audrey put it, is this a privilege or is it a right? And I think that is something which to me the answer is quite clear, but which we have allowed for a lot of slippage. And we are now in a place where there are legitimate arguments that are heard in corridors of power and taken seriously, that the state has this right for it to exercise indiscriminately almost. And I think what we need to do to start countering this is to really look at what national sovereignty means. Is there really such a tension? And I think Catherine was asking a similar question of Radhika in the opening plenary. Is there really such a big tension between national sovereignty and human rights that they are always up against each other? Ultimately, what are human rights? These are one of the main sources of human rights law are treaties which are drafted and negotiated by states, acceded and ratified by states, as a commitment to those on their territory and as a commitment to the international community in terms of how they see their own responsibilities and obligations. If that is not an exercise of national sovereignty, I do not know what is. So where is this tension? If you look at national constitutions, we see that many of them protect the basic rights of people in a manner which mirrors the rights that are entrenched and articulated in the core human rights treaties. So where is this tension? And I think this is something we really need to scrutinize. And we need to turn this argument on its head and say, no, it is in the interest of national sovereignty to protect, promote, fulfill, and uphold human rights. My second reflection on this is something perhaps a little more abstract. But it goes to the question of who actually is the sovereign power here. When we talk of national sovereignty, we talk of the state. But we don't talk just of the state. We're really talking of the executive. We're talking of a few people who, through various devices and means, are able to distance themselves from the trammels of democracy, to distance themselves from the oversight of parliament, of courts increasingly, and to take decisions with increasing impunity. Is this where sovereignty lies, or does sovereignty really rest in the people? In most countries, it does. And if my sovereignty rests with me, what right does my representative have to strip me of my sovereignty by making me a non-citizen? And I think that core question of where do states get their legitimacy from, where does sovereignty rest, has to be addressed. Now, the second fault line I want to focus on is the tension or the perceived tension between discrimination and statelessness. So states have an obligation to not discriminate, and states also have an obligation to not make people stateless. The way these dual obligations have increasingly been interpreted and implemented, as Matt pointed out, was to say, okay, we will make sure no one's made stateless. Therefore, dual nationals, naturalized citizens, they are not off target. We can focus on you. You have a big target on your back. Now, what does that mean? To me, it means a few things, but I think most importantly, it means the fact that this undermines our very understanding of why most people experience statelessness to begin with. Statelessness is almost always caused by discrimination, by racism, by patriarchy, by xenophobia, and I can go on. And it is this discrimination which is at the root of statelessness. And so to say that I am going to not make someone stateless, but I am going to target the dual national who can therefore be discriminated against it's double-speak in a sense. And it is something that we really need to question and scrutinize. If we are serious about protecting minorities, we must protect them, whether that makes them, whether the opposite of protection means that they will be made stateless or not. And a real case in point is the Shamima Begum case, where it was discrimination at many levels. So Shamima Begum, the UK citizenship law, and you will hear more about this in another panel where experts greater than I on this issue will go into much more detail. But the UK citizenship law basically, ultimately, in a very simplistic way, creates 3 classes of citizenship. Those who can never be deprived of their citizenship because they are born British and they don't have another nationality. Those who can be deprived of their citizenship because they are born British and have another nationality. And those who can be deprived of their citizenship and made stateless because they are naturalized as British. Now, the discrimination with Shamima Begum is that because of her migrant heritage, there was an assumption that she fell into category 2, when actually she was never declared a Bangladeshi citizen. And so there we see even this protection against discrimination, this protection against statelessness, still ultimately resulting in being discriminatorily implemented to make this person stateless. Now, the third fault line that I want to reflect on is going back to Radhika's speech in the opening about the protection framework and the rights framework. The framework of we will look after you, and the framework of you are a person with rights and agency. Okay? And while David was explaining to us the reasoning behind why the term cancelled was used for our arts program, I started thinking about the 1954 Convention definition on statelessness. Someone who is not considered a national by any state under the operation of its law. Where is the person in that statement? Where is the agency of that person? How does that law, how does that definition view the individual who is impacted? As someone who is not considered a national by any state. All agency, all power, all right to recognize rests with the state. And then you turn to UDHR Article 15. Everyone has the right to a nationality. Where does that provision situate the individual? No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of this right. Where does that statement situate the individual? And we see 2 provisions which are really at odds with each other. Because we have the individual protected, the individual respected on one, and the state's perspective guarded on the other. And I think it is possible to come to a meeting point where both of these happen. But it's not by eroding the individual's rights. It's by recognizing that the state's role ultimately is to protect rights. And therefore, there is a marriage of these 2. This is why when we at the Institute conceive of our work and our mission, we talk about protecting the right to a nationality for all and promoting inclusive societies. This may sound like a strange thing to say, But eradicating statelessness is secondary to us. We want to ensure that everyone's right to a nationality is protected, promoted, and fulfilled, and everyone has the right to live in equal societies, in inclusive societies. And as long as states continue to concentrate power to strip citizenship of their own citizens, this will not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amal. I think you have really, first of all, of course, for identifying these fault lines very nicely, tying into the various earlier presentations, but also for sharing with us some concrete examples of how we can counter this worrisome phenomenon. Well, I think we have covered a lot of interesting perspectives, personal stories, historical context, views from both practitioners and from scholars. There's now some time for Q&A, and I see many questions, very good. My colleague Nanny has a mic, and can you please also state your name and affiliation? Maybe let's start here in front and then we move to the back.
Thank you. Again, Mohammed Lanizi, the founder and director of Kuwaiti Bidoon movement. Now, as you explain about Jack, Shamima, and even Jawad, they lost their nationality from their countries. Now they moved from area, which is they were citizens to countries, to area which is dark, where they are. Now, I believe that those people and anyone like them, the United Nations should be responsible about them. There should be something clear that anyone lose his nationality, he become a citizen for the United Nations. Because the United Nations is responsible about all of the countries. There should be, I suggest to be a procedure that anyone lost his nationality, direct, he be related to the United Nations. The United Nations responsible about him in special procedure to give him at least his human rights. Now, we are not speaking about the citizenship for another country. When he loses his nationality, he will lose all of his human rights. No education, no health service, no at all anything. So that's the first thing. For example, in Kuwait, they are now stealing our identity. We were citizens in this country. They isolated us. Then they took our original documents, then they give us false documents, and now anyone go and visit Kuwait, they have a lot of money, they make a big office, they welcome any visitor, and they have millions of dinars to make false information with staff for that, and anyone come, oh, look to this, the data is good. Anyone come and look to the data in Kuwait, they'll say, oh, you are perfect, you are doing a good job. But they get us from being Kuwaiti to stateless, and now they try to get us out of statelessness to be belonging to a false country, to sell us to Comoros or to any other country, just to get us from stateless. Then we lose our rights to be stateless. Here, I am asking for international protection for the Bidoon inside Kuwait. By this, we are speaking about ending of statelessness by 2024, which is 5 years from now. We need immediately action to go to Kuwait and the United Nations be responsible about the stateless people in Kuwait and look after them and make them under their responsibility to look on the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Fateh?
Thank you. I'm Fateh Hazam. I'm Palestinian with the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies and proudly associated with ISI. A couple of thoughts. I think it's really important not to frame the deprivation of nationality as a policy measure only or primarily in the context of anti-terrorism measures. That certainly is an element that maybe motivates some Western countries, perhaps, but it is not an element that motivates Bahrain, for example, which is really the attempt to crush political dissent, or in Kuwait, which is really the attempt to exercise some sort of, ethnic, vague notions of ethnic tribal chauvinism that decides, who is Bidoon and who is not. Certainly not in the case of Palestinians, which is a similar case to the Bidoon in the sense of denial of the right to self-determination. So I think it's really important to think about deprivation of nationality in much broader terms than anti-terrorism. And the second thought I wanted to contribute is the battle against such a policy measure can take the legal front based on two principles. If deprivation of nationality happens after a court procedure, as you were saying earlier, about, for example, the case of the Asians, people who have already been convicted of a crime, whether it's a domestic violent crime or of international terrorism, then the added measure of deprivation of nationality risks the illegal principle of double jeopardy, to be punished twice for the same offense. That is one aspect of what we can use to battle against it. If the measure is taken without a conviction, then you're talking about the lack of due process, the lack of self-defense, a complete violation of the most basic principles of the rule of law. Then it becomes entirely arbitrary as an executive or administrative measure with no possibility of a legal procedure. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Lady after. Yes, yeah. Let's see how far we get.
Hello, my name is Habiba. I'm from Oman. Actually, I wanted to say the same thing from Palestine, but I would like to add also activists, human rights activists, when they are on travel ban for years and years and years, they are stateless as well, because the governments are using this as a tool to stop the human rights activities. And you don't have rights, and you are like in prison without any criminal. In some countries, they don't want to be a record in international, like they deprive nationality, so they just took away your travel documents and your IDs, and you are locked in the country for years. Ahmed Mansour is an example, and when he didn't stop his activities, he ended up in prison, still there, and he's tortured. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very important to share experiences, as Laura has mentioned, but also feel free to ask any questions to the panelists. You're ready? Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Alison Harvey, just to pick up on Audrey's point about is deprivation of citizenship yesterday's story and the restrictions that the previous speaker just talked about, the future. Obviously, the UK tried that experiment in the 1960s with the Commonwealth Immigrants Acts, where it stripped out the right of abode, as it called it, the right to enter and remain in your country from British nationality. And the UK still insists that those forms of nationality that do not carry a right to enter or remain are still forms of nationality. And mean that you are not stateless. And I wonder if the panel has a view on that. If you have a nationality with no right to enter or remain, is that enough to count as a nationality?
Thank you. Who would like to respond in the panel? And looking maybe at Matthew, UK connection. Yeah? Do you have a mic? And otherwise.
Well, thank you for those questions and observations. I think they're really good ones. The first one on the issue of a kind of UN citizenship, I mean, I think this is partly an issue of priorities. I think one should say, one shouldn't give up the fact that, I mean, I'm basically an abolitionist when it comes to issues of stripping citizenship. I just don't think states really should have that right. Morally, which is how I work, because I'm not a lawyer in the first place. And so my concern about the kind of UN dimension of it is really, though, I mean, while I can see a kind of powerful normative argument for that, it may just end up taking the pressure off the particular states to get rid of these laws that strip citizenship in the first place. I can also see a number of kind of practical problems, like states agreeing on that, like our other kinds of examples of international protection, for example, for refugees. Some of them, in those circumstances, have restrictions placed on certain people that have engaged in serious crimes and things like that. So, I mean, one would need to work through that. And one would also have to ask the question about how, for example, if we went to the case of Shamima Begum, you know, Syria, where she is located, would respond to those kinds of, that kind of UN protection as well. It's worth thinking about. I mean, it revives in some ways global debates that occurred after World War II, where there were considerations about whether one should create an independent global status for refugees and stateless people as well. Just on the second question, I agree, I completely agree with your point that I don't think this is just about terrorism. I think it is for some states, but the kind of Bahrain example actually reminds me of the historical critiques of banishment that proliferated by liberal thinkers in the late 18th century and during the 19th century, that expulsion was political. It's about getting rid of political elites in those contexts. It's got very little to do with terrorism there. And part of the point I was making in my UK case is, even though it's a very small element at the moment, there's a sense in which even these terrorist laws can creep over into other areas. And that's partly because it is connected, as Audrey said, to broader patterns of skepticism about immigration and the desire to control, and conceptions about who really is a member of the polity too. So I think sometimes if we just focus on that terrorist dimension, it's far too narrow. I accept your point about double punishment. I mean, that raises all sorts of issues about just what kind of activity citizenship deprivation is in the first place, though, whether it is just a kind of administrative consequence of certain I suppose, crimes, or whether, violations of rules, or whether it's a punishment in itself.
I don't have a lot to add to what Matt said. On the issue of punishment, though, I would resist the idea that where the state crafts it in a way that doesn't make it pursuant to conviction for a crime, I would not relinquish the claim that it's punishment and punitive. Right? I think denationalization, whenever and however it is affected, is punishment. I would also I concede your point entirely that this is not exclusively not about terrorism, but I wouldn't be so quick to concede that it's not about national security, in the sense that denationalization is uniquely connected to characterizing whoever the target is as a threat to the nation as such, in a way that seems oddly, where does that stop? Why is the ordinary criminal not a threat to the nation, right? Because a crime, of course, is always first and foremost an attack on the state. That's the way that criminal law is framed. The victim of the crime is the secondary victim of it. So I would just resist that. I'd say it's always punitive whenever it happens. Alison's question, I have a harder time answering, though I think it's a very good question. And it's really just because of the Byzantine nature of British subjecthood, empire, and so on that makes it such a difficult question to give a quick response to. I would say, though, that what I was talking about earlier, just highlighting, was the use that you were mentioning about passport confiscation as a tool of achieving some of the same ends, and how that can be harder to reach sometimes because it can be done, as you say, very informally, very surreptitiously, and so it becomes quite slippery. And I would just urge us to be attentive to that. I think states are also willing to use it in part because they can claim, hey, we're not stripping you of citizenship. This is a temporary measure. It's just, as we know about states of emergency that are allegedly temporary, there's a way in which they have a way of not ending. And only to the last point about Bahrain, to me, I think what you've really highlighted is that citizenship deprivation, when it's followed by expulsion, I think of as the political equivalent of the death penalty. You become dead to the state. Right? You're somewhere else, but you are no longer. Right? In some ways, when you aren't physically expelled, that's what used to be called civil death. You are dead within the state. It's social death, the way that slaves are socially dead or civically dead in the state. And so there's a way in which I think it might be helpful to understand the connections in that way.
Jawad?
Just short comment. I think if we agree that the nationality is not privilege, it is right. It is right of rights. Without having nationality, you cannot have right. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of to have your political and civil rights, and so on. So who has the right to take away from you the basic rights? If you lose it, you will lose the rest of the lives. So I think we should agree that never ever it should be part of any penal code. You cannot punish someone for certain crimes, whatever crime is it, to let him to be stateless. It is wrong, basically, and exactly I'm defining it is like a social death. It is like a civil death. And it is so more painful even if you lose your nationality. It's more painful even if you are stateless from the beginning. Why? Because if you are already citizen, you're already practicing your rights, and suddenly you will lose it altogether. It is more painful of that ones. About the court, if there is no justice and there is no independence of the power within the state, and there is no democracy, never ever we can depend on the court to say that it is a court order. Many people, they advise us to go and proceed all the court procedure in Bahrain. Alistair Bates, for example, when I met with him in 2002, he said, okay, you can resume all your court procedures in Bahrain, then we can see what we can do about it. One of our colleagues, Ibrahim Karimi, he done so. The court decision was that it is totally the rights of the state to revoke any citizen nationality without giving any evidence. They are much more aware about the security about this on the state than any others, and they are not obliged to give any evidence, and that's it. He's been put in jail for 2 years. After that, he's been deported from Bahrain, and he's living now in exile. Thank you.
Just one final concluding thought, picking up on what both Audrey and Jabhat said. I think if you put this down to a slogan or to a tweet, it would be that nationality is a right, deprivation is always a punishment. And I think if we can agree on that, that's a starting point. Thanks.
Thank you. I know there are more questions, but I was told to stop at 1 o'clock, and preferably a little bit before 1 o'clock, because as you know, there will be more sessions. So I will have to conclude, sorry for that, but please feel free to engage with the speakers also informally after the panel. I'm very sorry, but you still have the opportunity afterwards to engage with the speakers.
We are available, we can talk over lunch.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your good questions and elaborate answers. I think this has been a very interesting and insightful panel. Now, it's impossible to summarize everything that has been said, but a couple of key takeaways, in my view, are that deprivation of nationality has a very severe impact on individuals and their human rights, and they should be very sparingly used, or in my opinion, not at all. That there is a danger in current attempts across Europe and beyond to revive this symbolic power. That deprivation of nationality is about exporting risks, about moving the problem around like a hot potato instead of states actually taking responsibility. That deprivation of nationality is also about a denial of justice for the victims as well. It's a bar to accountability. That deprivation of nationality is a discriminatory practice, really violating one of our highest international law norms. So in short, I think we should be very careful about our precarious citizenship. To come back to the title of this session, and the signs are not that promising, but luckily with all the brain power assembled in this room, and of course also beyond, we can and should do also something about it, and I'm happy that many efforts in the good direction have already been taken, especially by the organizations also involved in this panel, as was already explained by Amal. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks to all the speakers. Please join me in thanking them. And thanks to the organizers of this conference, and I hope that the coming days will be truly inspiring and also useful to you. Thank you.